Mark Kimmitt is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Middle East Policy and former Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. He joins me now in the studio. Thanks for joining me today. You've been in Baghdad all this week. What's the situation like there now?
Well, there's still a lot of tension. As you said in the intro, there's still a wide gap between what the protesters want and what the government is willing to provide. The Grand Ayatollah Sistani down in Najaf has played a very, very strong mediating role, but there's still a long way to go before there's resolution.
Okay. How much are these anti-government protests that we're seeing in Iraq related to anti-government protests that we've also been seeing in Lebanon?
Well, it's very similar to what we see not only in Lebanon, but we also see it in Bolivia. We also see it in Hong Kong. This is a general repudiation of the status quo governance. There's a large disparity between what the people on the ground want and what the government wants to provide.
How have these protests evolved since they began in October? First, we saw people protesting things like lack of jobs, basic services, or corruption, but now they've evolved into protesters wanting things like self-governance.
Well, I think what we've seen over the past few months is that the protests have evolved, as you say, from the fundamental issues, but then once the government started offering reforms, they didn't believe it. They didn't believe that the government was serious. They believed that the government wants simply to stay in power. They don't like what's on offer, and that's why it gets larger and larger.
The protesters are calling for political reforms. Do you think they'll get that?
I don't see how they can't. The government is relooking the election law. The Grand Ayatollah has said we need to change the higher election commission. I think there's a willingness for the government to change, to step down, but under the right conditions, not as we saw in Bolivia where it was a near coup, not what we're seeing in Hong Kong, but they're trying to make it a methodical constitutional process. But there will be change. The protesters won't stop.
Okay, so I wanted to ask then, where do you see this headed? Protesters will stay out, and do you see more people joining the movement?
I really don't. The protests seem to be at a point now where they've sort of peaked. The trauma, the killings, the riots that you saw in the southern provinces, Basra and Nasiriyah, that may continue. But in Baghdad, I mean, we had a situation last night where the protesters took the night off to watch the Iran-Iraq football match, and now they're back in Tahrir Square. So hopefully, as long as the government doesn't overreact with their security forces, I think we'll see it somewhat stable.
All right, football's still important. Mark Kimmitt, thank you.
Certainly it is.